It was the kind of place you only see in nightmares. A village cut off from the rest of the world. No roads lead to it, no maps chart it, and most people in the surrounding towns refuse to even acknowledge its existence. Hidden between towering mountains and bathed in a perpetual fog, it was known to the locals as the Forgotten. No one knew why it was abandoned. Some said it was cursed. Others whispered about strange rituals performed in the dead of night. But no one dared to enter. No one except for Sarah and her friends. Sarah wasn't a believer in ghost stories. Her friends loved poking fun at the village's mystery and decided to make it their next adventure. A weekend trip, nothing more. But as they stood at the entrance of the Forgotten, a deep unease settled in Sarah's chest. The village seemed to breathe, the fog thickening, curling around them like unseen hands, almost as if it were alive. What they didn't know was that once you enter this village, it never lets you leave. What would you do if you found yourself standing at the entrance of a place like this? Would you turn back or press forward? The village was eerily quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet you'd expect in a remote place like this, but the kind that presses down on you, filling your ears with a roaring void. Every footstep echoed unnaturally, and the fog seemed to cling to them tighter with each step. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her friends laughed, brushing off her unease. "It's just an old village. Nothing more," Tom said, his voice lacking the confidence he was trying to project. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. It was as if they were being watched. That's when they saw it, the first sign that something was terribly wrong. A house, its windows shattered, stood at the end of the street. Carved into the wooden door was a single word: beware. Curiosity got the better of them. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed her friends inside the old house. The air was heavy, each breath feeling like it was pulled through thick smoke. Every corner seemed darker than it should be, and the fresh footprints they found didn't belong to any of them. "Who's been here?" James asked, his voice shaky. No one answered. They were too busy staring at the footprints, each one deeper and more pronounced the further into the house they went. Suddenly a loud bang echoed from upstairs. The sound was followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper: "Leave before it sees you." If you heard a voice like that, would you leave immediately? Or would your curiosity keep you exploring? Sarah led the way upstairs, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might burst from her chest. The others followed close behind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. As they reached the top of the stairs, the temperature plummeted. Their breaths became visible in the suddenly icy air. And then they saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its face was hidden beneath a veil of shadow. They froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. Without thinking, Sarah reached out to touch the wall beside her, but her hand passed through it as if it weren't even there. That's when she realized this wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse. "Get out! We need to get out!" Tom shouted, pulling at the front door with all his strength. But it wouldn't budge. They tried every window, every door, but each one led them back inside. The village wasn't just abandoned. It was a trap. Sarah's breathing became ragged as she backed away from the door. "It won't let us leave. We're trapped here. With it." The realization hit them all at once. Whatever was in this village, it wasn't just haunting it. It controlled it. Question for viewers: have you ever felt truly trapped in a place you couldn't escape? What would you do if there was no way out? They stood in the center of the room, their breathing quick and shallow. It was as if the house itself was closing in on them. Every door they opened led them back to the same place, and the windows, though they seemed clear, showed nothing but darkness beyond. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as a strange, low whisper filled the air. It was faint at first, but slowly it grew louder, more insistent, almost as if it was calling her name. She turned to look at her friends, but they seemed oblivious to the sound. "Can't you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Tom replied, his face pale and tense. The whisper became clearer, more distinct. It was coming from upstairs, where they had seen the figure. Without thinking, Sarah started moving toward the stairs again, as if something beyond her control was guiding her. As she reached the top of the stairs, Sarah could feel her pulse quickening. The hallway stretched out before her, long and impossibly dark, but at the far end, the figure was waiting. It hadn't moved, but its presence felt heavier now, more oppressive. Its eyes, they glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of cold, eerie light that seemed to stare straight into her soul. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, the whisper growing louder, filling her mind with thoughts that weren't her own. "Come closer." The voice echoed inside her head, though its lips hadn't moved. The urge to obey was overwhelming. Behind her, she heard her friends calling her name, but their voices were distant, muffled, like they were a million miles away. She took a step forward, then another, as the figure reached out toward her with long, bony fingers. Just as she was about to reach it, something snapped inside her. A surge of fear so intense that it broke whatever spell had been holding her. She screamed and stumbled back, crashing into Tom and James, who had run up behind her. The figure vanished, but the terror lingered. Back in the living room, they collapsed onto the old creaky furniture, their hearts still racing. Sarah was shaking, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. But as they sat there, trying to catch their breath, James noticed something half buried under a pile of rubble near the fireplace. It was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and its cover cracked. The group gathered around as he opened it, revealing page after page of handwritten notes, diaries from someone who had lived in the village long ago. This might explain everything, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. The entries were filled with stories of strange occurrences, people disappearing without a trace, shadows moving in the night, and the feeling of being watched. The writer spoke of a presence that haunted the village, something that lived in the fog and fed off the fear of those who wandered too close. One passage, in particular, stood out. The village is alive. It watches. It waits. And once you enter, it never lets you leave. Sarah's stomach twisted. The more they read, the clearer it became. They were not the first to be trapped here, and worse, the village had claimed many before them. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the house grew thicker, more oppressive. The group's nerves were fraying, and the weight of the village's curse was becoming unbearable. Tom paced back and forth, his hands shaking. "This is all your fault," he shouted at Sarah. "You were the one who wanted to come here." "It wasn't my idea," Sarah snapped back, her voice filled with frustration and fear. "None of us believed the stories. We all thought it was just a joke." James, sitting on the floor with the journal in his lap, looked up at them, his face pale. "It doesn't matter whose fault it is. What matters is that we're stuck here, and something is coming for us." The tension in the room was suffocating. Every shadow seemed to move, and the silence was filled with an unseen presence, watching, waiting. The whispering had returned, now louder, almost deafening, and it was no longer just Sarah who could hear it. "Do you hear that?" James asked, his eyes wide with fear. "It's coming from inside the house." Question for viewers. Do you think the house itself is alive? What would you do if you were trapped inside a place like this, with no way out? In a fit of desperation, Tom grabbed a chair and hurled it through the nearest window. The glass shattered, and for the first time since they entered the village, the group felt a glimmer of hope. "Come on," he yelled, climbing through the broken window. One by one, they followed, stumbling out into the fog-covered streets. The village was silent, the houses looming around them like tombstones in a graveyard. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the cobblestone paths, the fog swirling around them. But no matter how fast they ran, no matter how far they went, the scenery never changed. The same houses appeared again and again, as if the village itself was twisting, reshaping, keeping them trapped within its labyrinth. "It's no use," Sarah panted, slowing to a stop. "We're not getting out. It won't let us leave." Tom screamed in frustration, kicking at the ground. There has to be a way. There has to be. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The village had them, and it wasn't going to let them go. Hours passed as they wandered the endless streets of the village. The fog grew thicker, the shadows longer. It felt as if the very air was suffocating them, pulling them deeper into the village's grip. The whispers in their minds grew louder, and soon they began to hear other things. Voices of people they knew, of loved ones long gone. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked, his eyes darting around wildly. "My brother. I heard his voice. He's calling me." "That's impossible," Sarah shouted, grabbing him by the arm. "Your brother isn't here, Tom. None of this is real." But Tom shook her off and ran toward the sound, disappearing into the fog. The others called after him, but their voices were swallowed by the mist. One by one, they started to break down. James swore he saw his mother's face in a window. Sarah kept hearing her name, whispered from all directions, as if the village was mocking her. Every corner they turned, every door they opened, led them back to the same place, the heart of the village, where it all began. Sarah, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, found herself standing in the living room of the same house where it had all started. Tom and James were nowhere to be seen. She was alone, alone with the presence that had been haunting them since the moment they stepped into the village. The figure was there again, standing in the doorway. Its eyes glowed brighter this time, and a cold, eerie smile spread across its face. "You were never supposed to leave," it said, its voice a chilling echo. "The village chooses who stays, and you belong here now." Sarah backed away, her heart racing. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, and the walls of the house began to close in around her. The whispers filled her ears, louder and louder, until they drowned out her own thoughts. Her vision blurred and the room spun around her. "Sarah!" a voice called out from the distance. It was James, his face pale with terror, running toward her. "We have to go, now." But there was no escape. The village had them. The figure was everywhere, its shadow lurking in every corner, its voice echoing in their minds. The house creaked and groaned, as if it was alive, and the walls continued to close in. Sarah and James stood back to back, their breaths shallow as the village seemed to close in on them. The figure watched from the doorway, its glowing eyes never leaving them. There was no fight left in them, no hope of escape. "We're not getting out, are we?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. James shook his head. "No, I think this place, it was always going to take us." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The fog outside the window thickened, creeping into the room like a living thing, wrapping around them both. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. James smiled weakly. "It's not your fault. This place, it's been waiting for us all along." As the fog consumed them, Sarah closed her eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of her own name being whispered over and over until it faded into nothingness. The village was silent once more, the fog heavy and thick as it rolled through the empty streets. From above, the houses looked like tombstones, each one a monument to those who had come before, those who had been claimed by the village. As the camera pulled back, new figures could be seen approaching, another group of travelers walking unknowingly into the trap, just as Sarah and her friends had. The village never stopped. It never slept. It was always waiting, always hungry for more. Do you think the village is truly haunted? Or is it something else? What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a place like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.